All right, very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to the webinar on Everyday Multiculturalism. My name is Chan Hong. I'm the Senior Fellow for Social Cohesion Research at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University. A very warm welcome to everyone here. Before I begin, let me just share with you that this session will be recorded. So don't worry if you miss out any of the slides. You can always come back and do the review of that on the website later. Right, so for the benefit of people who log in from overseas or those who are not familiar with the work of RSIS, let me just do a very quick introduction of the institution and the objective of having today's webinar. Right, RSIS is a global think tank, and it's one of the few schools that offer only graduate school education, mostly in the space of international relations and national security. So for today's subject, everyday multiculturalism and the work that we do on social cohesion, this is what we consider to be one of the important pillar too, right? When we talk about security in today's context. Right, so why are we doing this webinar on multiculturalism? Broadly speaking, I think there are three main objectives. So let me take you briefly through, right, before I introduce the speakers for today. Right, so number one, I think this concept of everyday multiculturalism is relatively underexplored in the Singapore context. This is to do with how we can potentially harness, if you ask me what is this, right? How we can harness some of the mundane routines, the daily activities, the norms, the things that we kind of take it for granted, the lived experiences that we have every day. How can we harness that, to build connections with people who are from different backgrounds? Right, and in today's environment, I think this is particularly important, right? Looking at what are some of the strength that we have, the connections that we can have and develop and to build on that. Now, related to that too, this area is also in a way inspired by a book that we recently published. It's called Confident Identities and Connected Communities. The book is actually a product of a conference that RSIS organized 2 years ago, 2022, on the International Conference on Cohesive Societies, which is supported by MCCY. Right, so the conference look at what are some of the different facets of social diversity that we have today, whether it's race, religion, or otherwise. And again, importantly, how we can build that connection with the social others. So the book is not just a collection of the speeches, but also we have thought leadership essays, one of which is contributed by Silveraj here today. Right, so we'd like to take this opportunity to share with you some of the featured chapters, and hope you will find it relevant. Right, and of course, the last objective for having this session webinar today is really to introduce everyone that we have a social cohesion research team in RSIS. So we're going to talk a bit more about that later after the end of the conversation. So without further ado, let me take this opportunity to introduce you today on the speakers. Just give me a moment, right? On the two special speakers that we have today, right, who will share with us some of their work, right, in everyday multiculturalism. The first one is Dr. Silveraj Velayutham, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at Macquarie University, and Dr. Laviana Kathiravalu, who is Associate Professor and Associate Chair of Graduate and Continuing Education at the School of Social Sciences in NTU. Right, so to kick off the session, I'll have Silveraj, right, to share with us this notion of kopitiam conviviality, right, and how can we expand our current academic thinking, right, on the notion, how notion of diverse societies can be linked to more kind of action-based community practices. Lavi would then explore, right, different facets of our everyday experiences as we look at different categories of people, right, of diverse communities, right, and how we can again engage one another better. And finally, building on both the presentations, I will then move on to discuss how potentially we can shift the discourse from one that is focused on differences, between one group versus the other, to one that, in my opinion, it's more on the similarities, whether it's similarities in terms of shared challenges or shared experiences, and so on and so forth. All right, so for this particular webinar, we have each speaker will have 15 minutes for the sharing, and then followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. So at the Q&A, you can type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, right? And then we will take it on and we'll get the speakers to respond to that accordingly. And then before we wrap up, I'll have a 5-minute introduction of the Confident Identities and Connected Community book, right? The book that is a product of the ICCS, right? So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker for the day, Dr. Silveraj, to share with us his view of everyday multiculturalism. Raj, please.
Thank you, Chan Hoon, and thank you everyone for joining in this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here and again presenting this work to listeners who are in Singapore and elsewhere. Basically, my chapter in this book that Chan Hoon was mentioning is actually a culmination of ideas based on probably 20 years of research on race relations, racism, and everyday multiculturalism in Singapore. And throughout the course of the 2 decades, I've documented and theorized everyday racism, the social political context that has continued or has contributed to everyday discrimination, the nature of public discourse on racism and anti-racist or anti-racism activism in Singapore. Elsewhere, I've also explored ways in which convivial multiculture percolates in Singapore, particularly through spatial orderings, connecting and bridging work, and finally through intercultural habitus, where disposition, habit, and linguistic accommodation mediate local encounters. I've also looked at the role of humor, particularly in blue-collar and service sector workplaces in Singapore, and studied the way in which humor works in Singapore to, in a way, smooth relationships as compared to, as it takes place in other contexts, like particularly in Australia, where the kind of humor tend to be fairly disparaging and aggressive. So just as a caveat for this paper, although my research focuses on everyday mundane encounters and intersubjective relations, we should not ignore the larger sort of forces, particularly state, institutional, and structural, that mediate such interactions and local encounters. And also equally, I think it's important to acknowledge, right, and consider sort of the full range of interaction patterns, behaviors, and meanings at work, and the interconnections between happy as well as hard forms of existence. So while it may sound fairly romanticizing and sort of trivial, but I think we should not lose sight of the fact that it's living together is hard work. So let me turn to my paper briefly and speak to the main points. Resilient communities cope best with change, including the kinds of changes brought about by migration and diversification. Identifying and developing latent community strength is central to the sort of current thinking on community resilience. Though tensions and racism exist and have always existed and should be addressed, many Singaporeans have significant strength in coping with everyday diversity. So this everyday all Singapore strength has evolved over time, by necessity, probably over two centuries. A resilient approach suggests that the rich potential to harness and adapt these latent strengths in the next phase of Singapore's diversity journey. So in this paper, we draw on our research on everyday multiculturalism in Singapore, current academic thinking on superdiversity and conviviality, and link these to an action-focused, everyday strength-based approach to building community resilience. So this is where we propose a metaphor. It can be anything, but we came up with the kopitiam metaphor, or rather kopitiam conviviality, to capture the sort of everyday intercultural strength that may be drawn upon to productively engage with Singapore's diverse cultural landscape. So as we know, kopitiam is a sort of institution in places like Singapore and Malaysia, and people hang out, meet, spend time eating, drinking, chatting, pastime. But there's also a place which is vibrant, dynamic, in fact, a sort of a source for kind of hybrid cultures, eating cultures, and other practices to emerge. So we see that as a way of looking at this idea of conviviality. So first, I think the main concepts in this paper that we explored is superdiversity. As many of you know, superdiversity draws attention to the diversity of diversities in the plural, including the structural and inherent complexities characteristic of a culturally diverse population in a particular setting. While terms like multiracialism and multiculturalism invoke certain political ideologies and policy legacies, superdiversity is more an explanatory approach to understanding the many complex intersections and relations of identity, power, and inequality in migrant-receiving societies. So this not only includes the standard intersections of gender, race, class, ethnicity, but also highlights other varieties of differences, such as immigrant status, visa categories, PR or employment pass, or work permit temporary, and so forth, and the varying conditions and statuses attached to different migrant visa pathways, and the stratifications of multicultural urban citizenship these produce. So like superdiversity, everyday multiculturalism is a meso-level methodological and conceptual approach to understanding the everyday relations, practices, possibilities, and the outcomes of everyday living in superdiverse societies. Everyday multiculturalism as an approach has, broadly speaking, 5 main points of focus. 1, a concern with how, meaning process, and why conditions of possibility as new communities of difference form or not, as the case may be. 2, identifying the shape and timbre of social relations in situations of lived cultural diversity, such as how tensions and divisions brew and are challenged or worked through, as well as patterns of affinity and solidarity, disjuncture in the divisions in diverse contexts. 3, describing changing patterns of identity and belonging and the nature of new social ties. 4, identifying patterns of contradiction and ambivalence in coexistence, including patterns of hate and racism at everyday level. And finally, everyday multiculturalism focuses on the sort of exploring the nature, malleability, inclusiveness, and resilience of new forms of community in diversity, more established urban multiculture, and the shifts and reworkings of identities, belongings over time. So all these experiences are mediated, as you can see from the slide. They overlap with the structures and counters and so forth. So taken together, the concepts of superdiversity and everyday multiculturalism offer productive insights into the opportunity structures that influence patterns of coexistence in everyday intercultural sociality, especially in a place like Singapore. These ideas attune us to the everyday social, cultural, and structural forces that enable or limit the emergence of solidarities and affinities in diversity at everyday level across varying axes of difference. Though both concepts overlap in their approach and orientation towards the study of living in culturally diverse society, everyday multiculturalism's concern with the everyday social relations in situations, their underpinnings, patterns and possibilities, and even potential outcomes offer invaluable lessons on where and how they work or fail. So with this insight, we can arm ourselves with strategies and tools to effect positive and productive social relations among strangers who must coexist. So maybe next slide. I think that's the last slide. So this is where we bring in this idea of convivial labor in community resilience. So together with super diversity and everyday multiculturalism, we enroll a third concept called conviviality, invoked by the British sociologist Paul Gilroy, who says conviviality refers to the process by which coexistence and accommodation are made possible. Originating from the Spanish word convivencia, it has a more nuanced meaning that captures a sense of rubbing along, not just happy togetherness, but also negotiation, friction, and sometimes conflict. So it signals belonging in new forms of community as practice as hard labor. As Greg Noble, an Australian sociologist, argues that we should see this hard work as a form of labor, not just because it's hard, but because it is productive, transactional, and cumulative. Creating things like community and identity over a period of time is hard work. Like learning any new skill, whether learning a musical instrument or learning to cook or sing, to play football or mathematics, it takes work, practice, discomfort, and careful listening for a skill to become a habit, achieving both proficiency and harmony. Thus, approaching the diversity question through the lens of convivial labor captures the reality that living with and adapting to difference are not always easy. Approaching these challenges as problems that are or can be worked through acknowledges both the ambivalent and hopeful dimensions of social change and spotlights the active role demanded of all stakeholders, from individual to the government. In fostering more helpful communities in difference, things can get tense or go awry, but working together in good faith can help turn things around. So in the main section of the chapter itself, we offer a number of sort of examples, particularly of everyday encounters between neighbors along common corridors, void decks, on public transport, at the wet market, hawker center, and shops. So we suggest that such examples are commonplace in Singapore's HDB heartland, and so too the transformation of heartland neighborhoods. Yet it is this kind of everyday encounters and interaction, however fleeting, sustained over time, that can lead to positive and productive relationships. Other examples that we covered include service, like gift exchange, and helping culture. So, I mean, these are essentially core foundations of community connection. Thinking about festive treats exchanged between neighbors during Chinese New Year, Hari Raya, and Deepavali, or exchanges just as frequently occur outside festive occasions. Not everything needs to be explicitly about cultural and religious differences. So we draw an example of our neighbor, my neighbor in Jurong, where I live, where we have established amazing relationship over the last 20 years, insofar as the Chinese neighbor next door comes over with impromptu goodies like rice and bread and 3-in-1 coffee sachets and so forth. And likewise, my mom, elderly mom who lives there, she receives hampers from the local residential council association, and there are things that she don't usually cook, and so what she does, she actually passes on to our Chinese neighbor. So that sort of exchanges, I think, that can be very meaningful, simple, but yet profound. And then there are the gestures of greeting, and not only do these forms of exchange knit together new forms of community across difference in the ways that involve retaining one's diasporic orientations while opening out across differences and sometimes borrowing across groups. But over time, they come to shape the communities involved. Other examples include food being central to everyday practices of religious accommodation. So it's not it is normal and unremarkable, for example, to see halal tables set up at wedding receptions and so forth, recognizing Muslims and Indian Muslim co-workers or friends. And so these kinds of accommodations are also built in the sort of urban fabric, which with halal designated sections in hawker centers and food courts. And there's a bit where we go into detail talking about the role of vernacular Singlish. I think this is quite a remarkable example in the way the way Singlish has come about, and how easily people from diverse background, including temporary migrants, whether it's the domestic workers or those on work permit, actually have learned swiftly to speak in Singlish, and the use of endearing terms like uncle and auntie to address non-family members, I think is completely unique to Singapore, right? When it comes to relating to strangers. So Singlish is a language that has evolved for close to 2 centuries since migrants arrived in Singapore. And from our research on everyday diversity at workplace, we discovered Bangladeshis, Filipino, Indonesian, Burmese, Tamil, and Chinese migrant workers adopting the use of Singlish and even incorporating words from their languages in their everyday interaction. So this suggests that Singlish will continue to evolve and can serve as a language that can bridge diversity. And finally, we talked about the urban commons. So I've already hinted about the common corridor, the void deck, and so forth. So I think these spaces fundamentally serve as parochial third spaces where people of quite different cultural and religious backgrounds encounter one another on neutral ground. And these spaces easily meet the required dimensions of what's referred to as third places, where enjoyment, regularity, pure sociability, social leveler diversity happens, and serves, if you like, a form of social infrastructure. And I think these are distinctively Singaporean spaces, and are shared. These distinctively Singaporean spaces are shared territory where there is consensus, convention that the space is owned by all and none. And like anywhere, there are sometimes negotiations and struggles over aspects of such sharing, particularly around noise and smell. But by and large, such tensions are a facet of high-density, intimate coexistence in the case of Singapore. So just to wrap up, I think viewing Kopitiam conviviality through a strength-based lens, circling back to the question of community resilience approach, in what domains of everyday life does convivial labor occur, and what skills and resources are there to build on. The research literature on community resilience suggests that this must involve identifying and harnessing latent strength and fostering community agency by enabling self-organization with particular attention to people-based connections. So crucially, this must be underpinned by inclusive social infrastructures, values and beliefs, knowledge and learning, social networks, and collaborative governance and leadership. A related approach is what is known as asset-based community development, which sets out methods that begin with qualitative mapping the existing formal and informal assets and resources in a community that can be co-opted. So thinking about the Singapore context, what then are the situation, everyday practices, modes of governance, places and spaces that can create an openness to others and foster new communities in difference? What are the existing strengths and assets in this picture we have drawn? Probably we can identify 6 core assets. That is, 1, individual resident capacities, right? We shouldn't underestimate capacities of Singaporeans, right, to navigate and negotiate difference. Local association, I pointed out to the RSIS or community clubs, neighborhood institutions, business, not-for-profit, and government, physical assets, right, the land, everything on it and beneath it, and exchange between neighbors, giving, sharing, trading, bartering, buying and selling, and finally stories. So in our anecdote from Everyday Singapore, we can see some common threads of practice that map easily on these. One, a helping culture, neighborliness, everyday gift exchange between four races, especially in HDB buildings, a rich diasporic food culture that also fuses different food traditions and everyday convivial, convivial spaces where food is consumed, government regulation that ensures communal spaces like HDB and hawker centers are inclusive by way of residential quotas and distribution of food stalls that are representative of various races, as well as the provision of safe and well-designed multi-generational recreational and leisure spaces in HDB development. Then we have the lingua franca of Singlish and distinctively Singaporean humor, celebrating and making space for elders, and finally, a willingness and ability to make everyday religious and cultural accommodations. Just to conclude, happy to take up questions. Like every nation grappling with these issues, Singapore is not perfect. The Diversity Project is a work in progress. Government programs, assistance and accommodation are the foundations stone for Singapore's multiracial success so far, especially recognizing and sponsoring hawker center culture, its intrinsic value in celebrating Singlish as a core aspect of national identity. After all, as hybrid lingua franca, Singlish has its heart the labor of togetherness, of muddling across difference. Thank you. Sorry, I went too long.
No worries. Thank you, Raj. Thank you for sharing. I think it's important that you set the stage, giving the audience a overview of what everyday multiculturalism is and is not. I think the points that you have shared, I think resonate with me and also with Lavi, and we're going to build on that in a while. So at this stage, I'm going to move on to the next presentation. And I will let Lavi, who will take over and share her slides from there.
Okay.
Lavi, please.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? That's right. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen. So thanks so much, firstly, to Chan Hoon and everyone at RSIS for inviting me to be part of this session. I think it's fantastic, and congratulations on the book, Chan Hoon, and everyone at RSIS. So I'm gonna maybe take a little different tact from Raj's paper, and also maybe from what Chan Hoon is gonna present, which perhaps has more applied social science implications, but the research that I'm going to present today is part of a larger project that's interested in categorical complexity. So, how are categories of that are involved in multiculturalism? So, like categories that Raj talked about in terms of immigration status and gender, but specifically in this case, ethnicity for me, and I guess immigrant identity. How is that becoming more complex, especially with migration in the last 20 years or so, 25 years in Singapore? And how does that affect how we see each other, the politics of encounter, of multicultural seeing, right? And this research draws from my SSHRC funded fellowship that looks at second generation immigrant integration in Singapore and in Qatar. But in this project, in this presentation, I'll just be presenting on Singapore, right? So a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to go very quickly through the changing demographics of Singapore, because I think most of us know this, most of us based in Singapore, and I think Chan Hoon will talk about that a bit more as well. Then I'll talk about certain tropes or themes that came up when I talked to second generation Singaporeans, right? Themes around racial passing, the implications of minority identity or being identified as specific minorities, and the kind of impetus or desire to assimilate into a kind of Singaporean citizen or core. And then I'll present maybe a possibilities or learnings that we can take from neighboring countries in Asia, and specifically Taiwan, to think about perhaps how Singapore can capitalize on this changing multiculturalism in Singapore today. Right? And perhaps this can give us ideas as to how to capitalize on this multicultural or changing multiracial identity that we have as Singaporeans. Okay, so and firstly, just a quick note on methodology. I didn't really put it down here, but this research or this research today that I'm presenting draws from over 60 interviews with second generation Singaporeans. So basically, this term second generation comes from the migration studies literature, and second generation refers to people whose parents were migrants. So they could have been either born in Singapore or they could have migrated to Singapore at quite a young age. But some of them are PR, some of them have gained citizenship, but they have a recent migrant identity, right? So this was our sample of more than 60 people who we spoke to. Most of them, of course, were of Asian ethnicity because, as we know, most migrants to Singapore are of Asian ethnicity and come from other parts of Asia. So our sample reflected that. Of course, we don't know the breakdown in terms of where migrants come from, who actually gets citizenship. So we couldn't get a kind of representative sample, but so ours was more a kind of purposive and convenient sample. So just to give you a background on why this population of second generation is important, right? And one of the arguments of this paper, and the paper is under review right now at a journal, the data that this draws from, right? So is to convince you that the second generation is this kind of invisible but very large population actually in Singapore. I mean, if you look at our total fertility rate, and these statistics, of course, end at 2020, but just recently we heard that our total fertility rate has fallen below 1. Right, so we have one of the lowest total fertility rates in the world. Basically, Singaporeans are not replacing themselves, and we have not been replacing ourselves for quite a while, right? As you can see here, basically, this means that even though our population is growing, it is not necessarily growing because Singaporeans are having children, right? And our population is really growing because of immigration. And the graph on the right, of course, shows you trends of people who are getting citizenship as well as permanent residency over the last 10 years or so. And we can see it's basically quite steady. So we give out about 30,000 permanent residencies per year, and these, of course, become citizens eventually, at least some of them, at least about 20,000 per year, right? So this is what's contributing to the increase in our population. So when we think about the future of Singapore, if we think about the future of who our population is going to be made up, a large percentage of our population are going to be made up of immigrants and children of immigrants, right? Because a lot of these people migrate also not just as single people or as couples, but as families with children. So the case I want to make is that we need to pay attention to the second generation because they're an increasing proportion of the Singaporean population. And we don't have any research on the second generation or children of migrants in Singapore at the moment. So this is a really understudied area. The second batch of people I think that we need to pay attention to in terms of second generation are those with one parent who is a foreigner, right? So we know in Singapore, for example, as we see from this graph, we have a very high proportion of transnational marriages. About 1 in 3 marriages is to a non-Singaporean. And a lot of these people have children, often with the hope that they will get citizenship if their child is a Singapore citizen. And most of these transnational marriages are between Singaporean men and Asian non-Singaporean women, right? So the women come from countries like India and China, but also very much Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and the Philippines. Right, and this population, their kids are often mostly Singaporean citizens, right? Yet they have an immigrant parent, right? And their ethnic identity is again quite diverse if they have a Southeast Asian parent, right? So these are the two groups I think, that make up the second generation, those children of migrants and children with one parent, usually the mother who is a migrant to Singapore. And they're increasingly a bigger part of the population, which is why we need to pay attention to them, right? So despite this kind of growing, like migrant population, children with one immigrant parent, we see that the racial proportions in Singapore haven't really changed over the last 20 years, right? And I think Chan Hoon will talk more about that. And this is a very explicit policy, right? So this started not recently, but way back in the 1980s, right? That the racial ratio needs to be kept the same so as to not kind of rock the boat. It's possibly good for social cohesion, maintaining the kind of racial proportions in Singapore. However, one of the arguments that I've made elsewhere, and that this paper also kind of builds on, is to say that this kind of maintaining racial ratios is actually invisibilizing racial differences within the population, right? By slotting people into existing racial labels of CMIO, we're not acknowledging the actual diversity of the population, whether or not it's through immigration status or different linguistic backgrounds, right? It's a kind of homogenizing of a much more diverse multicultural population, right? So we have that multicultural population, and here we also have, a graph showing you non-residents, and of course PR. So you can see it's the employment pass holders, 11%, S pass holders, 10%, as well as PRs that eventually will move into the Singapore citizen category, right? Because the other categories cannot be naturalized, don't have a pathway towards citizenship. So let me go now into the heart of the paper. So some of the things that came up, so the questions we asked were about belonging, how the second generation felt belonging, their identity. And one of the most important things that came up is the importance of how you look and whether or not you can pass racially as Singaporean, right? So Ben, the Filipino informant in this study, for example, talks about, how he gets mistaken for one of the CMI races or a mixture of CMI races, and that helps him kind of feel like he belongs because he can pass racially as Singaporean. And Tian Yi, who is a second generation Chinese migrant who was born in Singapore, but her parents came from China, talks about the growing unacceptance of foreigners, especially if you don't look like you're Singaporean. For example, if you don't look like you're Chinese or Asian for most part, then you might struggle to be accepted here, right? So this also speaks to our immigration policy that mostly draws migrants from other parts of Asia, right? So when you don't look Asian, then it's kind of, okay, then, where do you come from, right? Are you really Singaporean? The questions are asked. And even though this is something that we see in our interview data, we know that from other research as well, that it is people who often don't look Asian who get identified as foreigners, right? Even though they may be Singaporeans or maybe PRs or may have lived here for a long time, the idea of what it means to be Singaporean is still very much informed by the primacy of the CMI labels, right? And these are Asian ethnic categories. And this is what I think then informs the ways in which people also encounter each other and label each other. So the multicultural seeing of each other is dictated by these larger structures, right? So if we think back to Raja's presentation and how everyday multiculturalism is informed by encounter as well as structures. So the structural part is what I'm saying influences the encounter in terms of how people label and see each other, right? And this has implications then for how people categorize each other, even though in reality, categories may be more complex, right? You may be Caucasian, white, American, born in America, but then take up Singaporean citizenship. Increasingly, we see more people who do not fit into the Asian label become Singaporean, but this is still not something that is very apparent, and it's not, the ways in which people characterize each other because of the existing structures and immigration policy. The second theme that came up was about minority identity and specifically being characterized as certain minorities, right? And here you can I'll give you a few seconds to read through the quote. So the top part, Maya, who's a Indonesian second generation Singaporean, talks about how it's easier, for her to integrate because Indonesian culture is similar to Malay culture. So that was a kind of positive part, right, of having this racial affinity with Malay culture. But then in the second, later on in the interview, she talks about how she's scared of being seen as Malay, right? Because of the negative stereotypes, as we know, associated with the Malay community in Singapore, as perhaps unproductive, less efficient. And this trope, of course, goes back to the colonial period with the myth of the lazy native, right? And continues to persist. And she's saying it's not because I become worried when they ask me because I'm Malay, not because I don't like the race, because I'm concerned that they have that kind of perception towards me, right? Of these negative characteristics, right? So we see here again that racial stereotypes and racial boundaries become reinforced even through this diversification of the population, right? Despite the diversification, there is still the older boundaries being enforced and older forms of perception, discrimination that are also taken on by new migrant communities, right? So in that sense, like structures don't seem to have changed significantly in that aspect, right? At least through this research. And finally, a point that came up was about the significance of citizenship as a mode of belonging, right? So here with second generation Keith, who was born in Singapore, but whose parents came from India. He was a PR, and he says, I was desperate to become a citizen, right? A kind of naive desperation, because he said, I didn't want to be left out of anything, that I couldn't be given an opportunity because I was not a citizen, right? So we need to see this kind of rhetoric within the larger differentiation of categories that has been going on, let's say, for the past 10 years or so, right? The gradations between someone who is a foreigner or non-Singaporean, a permanent resident, and a Singapore citizen have become more clear over the years. And I think about 10 years ago, Eric Thompson highlighted this in a piece that he wrote, right? So in terms of access to schools, in terms of access to other resources like healthcare, housing, we see increasingly these gradations. So gaining citizenship, attaining citizenship was really something that even second generation people who came perhaps initially as PRs or as foreigners really desired, right? Because it signaled not just, even if they were racially belong, even if they went to school here, that formal citizenship really enabled them access to resources that was an important part of that multicultural belonging as well, right? So, and finally, the last point that I want to make is that, generally, I think Singapore has been, at least according to the second generation research, we've been highly successful in terms of assimilating or integrating foreigners, right? We don't have any huge problems in integration. I think we've done quite well, right? But people have been assimilated into existing categories, right? And then my question is really at what cost, right? And I ask this because here we have an example of the loss of kind of linguistic diversity and of more multifaceted identities, because Nada, who's Indonesian, and she moved to Singapore when she was 9 years old and now a PR, but she's ethnically Chinese, right? And she said she had to take Mandarin in school and not Bahasa Indonesia because she was identified as Chinese. And so therefore Mandarin was her mother tongue, right? And now she struggles to explain her identity, right? She says, my race is fully Chinese, but her parents coming from Indonesia and she being born in Indonesia also is part of her identity, but she struggles to articulate that because that's not really possible within the kind of CMIO matrix, right, that Singapore generally operates under, because she's not Malay, she's Indonesian in terms of her heritage, but she's also ethnically Chinese, right? So this kind of lack of complexity in terms of being able to articulate multifaceted aspects of identity might be I think, might be a missed opportunity for Singapore, right? And why I say that is really because I've been learning a bit about Taiwan's new southbound policy, right? So this is a policy that the Taiwanese state basically adopted about maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, really as a way to capitalize on the ethnic heritage of its young people. So Taiwan, just like Singapore, also has a lot of Taiwanese men marrying women from Southeast Asia and having children, right? And of course, these children are also being assimilated into a kind of Taiwanese mainstream. But of course, Taiwan has different, geopolitical kind of considerations compared to Singapore. And to balance the kind of increasing presence of the larger kind of Chinese state, there was a kind of new southbound policy which involved more investment in Southeast Asian countries in terms of scientific investment, trade relations, but also in terms of educating new immigrants in the languages that their mothers spoke, right? So Malay, Khmer, Indonesian, Burmese, Filipino, Thai, Vietnamese. These were some of the indigenous languages that were taught in primary schools, right? And these children of these migrants were then seen as a way to link back to Southeast Asia, that Taiwan could form this kind of soft power links to Southeast Asia, in a way that I think Singapore could also think of doing, right? If we were more attuned to this diverse second generation population rather than assimilating them into an existing racial framework. So just as concluding thoughts, I've tried to show that we have an increasing complexity of identities in Singapore, and maybe older ways of thinking about multiculturalism don't work so well anymore, right? We need perhaps new models, more creative ways to think about this, because we're still assimilating into older categories, despite the fact that these second generation are more complicated, right? More complex. But how do we then embrace this new diversity? How do we teach people Khmer or Vietnamese while also maintaining a strong national identity that has for so long been rooted in this idea of CMIO? Can we balance that? Is this going to create more fractures, right? I don't know. So this is I'd be happy to hear your thoughts. And on a more kind of maybe sociological level, really, I think, we need to understand that categories and processes of categorization are inherently political, right? When we label someone something, that is a political process, right? And we need to bear that in mind when we're thinking about multiculturalism. What kinds of labeling take place within this larger discourse of multiculturalism? And for us as scholars, as social science scholars, I think we shouldn't just reproduce categories of practice, right? How people label each other in our work, but we need to think of analytical categories that express better how these, the nature of these categorizations, how they take place, right? And finally, I'd like to suggest that we need more rhizomic, processual, non-linear, and maybe relational understandings of identity and belonging. So thank you for your time, and sorry if I went
No worries.
over.
Thank you, Levy. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my slides. Do let me know if you cannot see the slides on the screen or you cannot hear me. Okay, so thank you so much for the presentation from both speakers, Levy and Raj. I think that a lot of the points that we have discussed or you shared, kind of dovetail into what I'm going to present next. My presentation is really looking at how can we foster that shared experience with the social others. And there is a chapter of that in the book, right, on the politics of engaging the social others. Before I begin, I'll just do a very quick overview of what I'm going to cover. The first point is about Singapore demography. I'm not going to spend so much time on that because I think both speakers have gone through bits and pieces of that. Second one is about, what does it mean to become one of us, right? So even as we have, or we know that we have a very distinctive Singaporean identity, I think the challenge has always been, okay, what does it mean to become part of this community? What is expected and what may be some of the trade-off, the contradiction, the negotiations that you have to undertake. A third one is, in my opinion, what may be some of the ecological fallacy when we discuss who is a part of us or who doesn't, right? Because I think a lot of these studies, if you really look at it from a more critical angle, you realize that, it doesn't really make sense, right? And there are certain areas that you need to fine tune, and we need to think outside of the box to see how we can then move on, perhaps to a different kind of discourse that can forge connection. Last but not the least, how do we foster that sense of we, right? And this is the part that I'm going to dive in a bit more to my personal thinking on what we can potentially explore as we move forward, to build a different kind of discourse that's based on similarities rather than differences. And of course, finally, what I hope to do is to use some examples that I have in a book that is up in another book, right, that's up and coming in 2 weeks' time, to share with you some of the examples and hopefully can inspire your thoughts on that. Right, so this particular slide requires no introduction, especially if you work in policy and you are looking at issues on migration, integration, marriages. Right, so Singapore is a hyper-diverse society. Ethnic ratio has remained constant over the years, but certainly you can see that the population has grown substantially over the last 50 years. And inter-ethnic marriages, inter-transnational as well as inter-ethnic marriages have gone, is fairly high, right, by global standards. So all in all, you're going to expect that Singapore society is going to be a very different, have a different social contour moving forward. Now, we often hear questions about what is Singaporean identity, what does it mean to become one of us. Now, if you do a very open-ended kind of survey, right, and this is what I did last year for this project, Our Place in the World, you get people to contribute, what will be the keywords, and you probably find a word cloud like the one that you see here, right on the right, and then you have food right in the center. A bit shallow, if you ask me, but I think this is normal because chances are, if you're going to ask anybody outside of Singapore, they will probably give you examples like this too, right? And the reason is because the whole idea of trying to measure, quantify, codify identity has always been a challenge because identity is a very amorphous social construct, right? This is not something that we carry with us every day at all times, who we are, Singaporean, what do we do, and so on, right? We are naturally more aligned with what we do, our day-to-day living, and the kind of activities that we pursue. While I have done the codification and the quantification and all the complex analysis in the last 10 years, this is a framework that, at least in social psychology, we use to identify, what is the concept of citizenship, what does being Singaporean or being one of us means. And the idea, this particular direction, right, is to kind of quantify it, have a checklist, and then you can see, what is important and, where are the gaps, so to speak. And this framework has been done in other parts of the world. So it's a checklist kind of work. Yes, so that might look interesting, and to some extent, it might be useful to inform what Singaporean is and what is multiculturalism is, right? So just to give you some insight, this is some of the key findings that again came up from this independent study, Our Place in the World, by Kanda Public last year in 2023, collected a sample of 1,500 people, and the findings generally has been quite consistent over the last 10, 15 years, right? Questions about multiracialism, the needs of being able to have a very functional experience, like being able to function on a day-to-day basis, that shared, journeys in the workplace, at national service, in the neighborhood, being able to speak in conversational English. These are very common functional traits, right, attributes. But the thing about this is that it's also very similar to other parts of the world, right? Even in monocultures like Japan, right? Maybe not multiculturalism, but certainly getting along well with colleagues, being able to speak, a basic command of the native language is important, right? So these are the top 10. I'm not going to go through in detail. You can always come back and look at this, in the replay. These are the bottom 10, if you like. By and large, in the case of Singapore, we don't emphasize so much on assimilation, right? It's really trying to look at how that can contribute to that sense of engagement in a day-to-day basis. Now, the challenge with a lot of the work, in my opinion, is this concept called the ecological fallacy. right? And this is actually something that is quite common, but I don't think we recognize that, as social scientists go about trying to distill, what does it mean to become one of us? Why are certain groups not integrating well, or how can we do better? All groups, whether you're looking at foreign or local, whether you're looking at Chinese versus the Malay versus the Indian, you can measure everybody along any dimension. Whether, for example, they believe that able to speak conversational English is important, right? And chances are you may find differences, right, between one group versus the other, between a local born versus a foreign born, for example. But the critical issue here is we actually ignore the fact that even if there's a difference, for example, the difference in the bell curve, there is a huge, huge overlap in terms of what the two groups believe to share, right? So if you look at the differences, the bell curve, right, and the overlap that you see at the bottom, I think a lot of times we kind of ignore the fact that even as we come together, we live on this island. There's actually a lot of overlap that we can harness, right? And this focus on differences rather than focus on what is in common, right? It's actually something of a very natural instinct that we all have. In psychology, again, Daniel Kahneman talked about this thing about system one thinking, right? And Jonathan Haidt, right, a moral foundation psychologist, and he talked about the fact that, by very nature, because we belong to different groups, ascribe identities like race, different religion, or different nationality, there is this natural tendency to attribute all kinds of behaviors, all kinds of moral reasoning to this, very fundamental differences, right? The stereotypes and so on. And this is the part where I think we failed to, or we could have done a better job, right? To harness that commonality, the intersections in our everyday living, right? To bridge that divide. Now, why do I say that? Right now, again, if you go back to the literature in psychology, for example, how do you foster, or how do you know when you are actually part of a larger entity, and how do you foster that sense of we, the sense of cohesion? Broadly speaking, you look at all the policies and programs, essentially they're just one or two things, right? Number one, you look at shared attributes, you look at shared heritage, you look at essentializing identity, whether it's CMIO or otherwise. Right. So, and we do that a lot, right? Because we believe that, hey, you know what, if we can all speak English, if we, can do a certain, have a certain habits, then we are all okay. We're going to be part of this entity and we're going to build cohesion. The other approach that is less commonly discussed will be, what will be the shared challenges? What will be the common purpose? What will be, some of the things that kind of bind us together very organically, right? And this is a part that I think we haven't we haven't got it right, right? I think there are certain areas, certain programs and interventions that we can do a better job, right? So coming back to Singapore, there's no disagreement that we are a multicultural society, right? And we all feel proud about that. And of course, we are also very proud that we have, diverse food that can cater to our needs, different kind of dishes from different communities. And going back to the word cloud, you can see food is a very important pillar, right, for some Singaporeans, defining who we are. And again, we're also very proud and to see that Singapore is one of the safest countries in the world, and we see ourselves as a garden city or city in a garden, right? And we use all of that, to inspire that sense of we-ness, of one singular identity and cohesion. But if you think about it, there's a lot more to being Singaporean than just a positive, because all of us, regardless of your background, we share similar challenges, right? So be that going for some kind of milestone examinations like PSLE, and if you have kids at some point in your life, you're always concerned and worried about your kids growing up, and we all have issues juggling, work-life balance. These are some of the day-to-day living. I think Raj also broadly mentioned about that when you talk about conviviality, right? That you do have to acknowledge that there are certain contradictions and ambivalence, in that. And none of that actually, this story actually captures what I'm trying to say perfectly, right? This is actually a story of DBS CEO, right, Priyesh Cooper, who is a naturalized Singapore citizen, that he struggles with anxiety, right? This is a report 3 years ago, right? And when I look at this, I read this headline, I look at the story, it kind of normalizes the social others, right? In a sense that no matter whether you're foreign or local, actually, we all face the same challenges of living in a complex city state. And these are actually the shared experiences that we could have harnessed as a community to develop the kind of strength to engage. Let me give you more example. This is, of course, from sociology, which not my discipline, right? But in sociology, we talk about homo duplex, right? Which essentially says that, human beings are creatures that exist in two levels. The first one is individual, and the second one is a larger part of a larger community. And the idea of fostering cohesion essentially is trying to find the switch that would take you from the individual to the hive meaning the collective. And there are a lot of experiences that we have on a day-to-day level that I believe could have created that opportunity for us to engage and make sense of that sense of we. Be that a rite of passage in our national service, we all agree, create that sense of bonding, or having that looking for what will be the common milestones in life, like examinations, PSLE, for instance, can all connect. You all feel that, hey, we're all part of this journey, whether you're foreign or local born Singaporeans. And I don't know how many of you here are parents, but as a parent, there's a very natural instinct in a way to look out for other kids or other parents with kids, right? When you hear of stories of tragedies happening to children and how the mother grieve or father grieve over those tragedies, I think we can connect instantly as a parent, because I think there's this very natural instinct that, takes us to a different level of cognitive functioning, right, as a parent, and I can connect, right? And of course, the other important area where we can connect with others will be in cases where we grieve together, right? And this is best illustrated when Lee passed away, right, in 2015, and you can see that whole outpour of national grief. People line up in the streets, even though it was raining cats and dogs, right? But the point is, these are the kind of shared experiences, not always the most positive experiences, but nevertheless bring us together as a community. And if you could harness that kind of experience, it will be one way for us to establish that kind of bonding. Right, this will be my last slide, right? And this is actually a book that I've worked on for the last 2 years. Essentially, we interviewed 12 immigrants and their families on their shared experiences in Singapore. I'm not looking for any heroic or outstanding kind of achievement, but really the day-to-day experiences and narrative of everyday citizenship of 12 immigrants. And like what Daniel Kahneman said, right? The system one thinking has always been, well, guess what? Immigrants are probably economically successful, like Priyesh Cooper, CEO, stress-free, emotionally unbreakable. The kids probably perform well in school and they're immune to the day-to-day hassles and challenges. Right? So these are the very natural, very group-centric kind of thinking. The moment you activate this social categorization of local versus foreign, Chinese versus Malay, people from one religion versus the other. But when you dive in further, right, you talk to them, right, you hear the stories, and you realize that immigrants are no different from us. They're just as kiasu. And the other interesting finding I found from talking to them is they also have this very tuition-centric attitude. If they cannot teach the kids who are worried about their studies, send them to the tuition center, right? Or maybe the kids will want to attend tuition. I'm not here to advocate tuition. I'm just sharing with you that this is the experience. And I want to go back to Raj, one of his earlier point, that the everyday experiences, what are some of the urban common spaces? My sister operates a tuition center, right? And during the evening, when you go there, you wait for the class to be dismissed. You will find parents from different backgrounds sitting there talking to one another. You will see the Vietnamese mother, you will see the Thai mother, you will see the Singaporean mother, maybe you see the maids. But people getting together, having small talk, right? Talking about what are some of the experiences in school, what are some of the programs that they thought could have done better, But those are very organic environment situations where you bring people together to talk, to engage, just like the kopitiam. So I think moving forward, the challenge is really how can we identify more of such spaces such that you can actually promote that more organic kind of engagement, which will foster bonding among people from different background. All right, so that's the end of my presentation. This is actually something that my staff reminded me to do, because we are starting up as a small team, so we are still hiring, and we're hiring both long-term and short-term. Long-term being researchers and admin managers, short-term meaning internship or secondment, whether it's from the public sector or from a people sector. So if you're interested, do log in to the website above or drop me an email, and then we can take this conversation forward. All right, so with that, I end my presentation. Thank you so much for staying with us, and I would like to open the floor for Q&A. So probably can have about 20 minutes of Q&A, and then we'll do a 5 minutes wrapped up. All right, thank you.
I think there are some questions already.
Okay, so we do have a question. I know it's always tough to ask the first question, so if anybody can ask a second question, that would be helpful too. And then we can go back to the first one. All right, so anyway, I got one question here. This is from Ekma Zuhari. Right, thank you for your fascinating sharing, Prof. Silveraj. So you talked about conviviality as labor or hard work. Conviviality is also unremarkable in quotes, or as you described later on, suggesting some kind of spontaneity. Could you speak to how one should conceptually make sense of these two seemingly contradictory aspects of conviviality? Raj, please.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the two papers. They were really insightful. Obviously, we're approaching the same kind of issue from a different perspective and disciplinary eye. As for the question, what I was trying to tease out there is the term conviviality. That's the way you pronounce it. Conviviality, from as defined in the English language, it's often tend to be looking at the sort of festive, happy, fun forms of togetherness. But the Spanish definition, where the word comes from, conviviencia, actually highlights something more nuanced. And then that is that what we may see as happy, getting along, people seemingly having fun, may actually be a product of hard labor. I said, things don't happen spontaneously, that people, individuals, groups, communities have to take the initiative, make the effort, do the hard work, right? So, and I think we do that in Singapore, right? When we meet, whether it's Chinese, Malay, or Vietnamese or Filipino, we're working to negotiate those differences, and where that happens is obviously, as Chan pointed out, that the kind of meeting points that we may share, that can allow us to kind of establish a sense of belonging and identity. Hope that helpful.
Thanks, Raj. Thank you so much. I have another question here by Francis Lim.
There's one on rhizomic.
Rhizomic, yes.
What is?
Right. There's one from Ambassador Ong on what is rhizomic. Is that the
Yeah.
term? Okay,
Yeah.
right.
So thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I threw that in without explaining it. So rhizomic is really a term that is come up with by the theorists Deleuze and Guattari in their book 1,000 Plateaus, and they talk about rhizomic as a way to connect that is a-centered, non-hierarchical, and non-signifying, right? So some of the kind of categories that I talked about, like citizen, PR, these are hierarchical, right? And they create certain hierarchies in our society, and the ways in which people label each other are hierarchical. And identities like racial identities like Malay, for example, seem to signify some negative categories to certain people. So if we have categories that are, you know, do not have such strong signifiers, are not so hierarchical, this could also facilitate the ways in which people see and categorize each other, right? And whether or not it's possible to have those type of categorizations, maybe not. Maybe there's, you know, kind of ground up ways in which people can relate and categorize each other that come up through these shared spaces that Raj and you know, this Chan Hoon talked about, and maybe we should prioritize those and privilege those over more hierarchical and signifying characteristics, right? So this is you know, rhizomic is just a way for us to kind of push us in different directions, right? To think about categories. Yeah, hopefully that's answered it.
Thanks, Lavi. I think that's I learned something new today. Okay, I have a separate question from Francis Slim, right? My question is on assimilation. And I think this is for you, Lavi, right? So based on the interviews and findings on assimilation from your presentation, do you think the xenophobia and microaggression can be addressed through policy? You know, like having a policy that particularly target you know, these kind of behavior, whether it's microaggression or xenophobia?
Well, I think we generally have very low levels of xenophobia in Singapore compared to you know, very explicit forms of violence or conflict that we see in other countries with maybe even lower levels of immigration percentage-wise compared to Singapore. So I think we already have very strong kind of state policies that are explicit, right, about encouraging immigration and the need for immigration in our country. So I think there is definitely a role for policy. Maybe there's, you know, that what I'm suggesting is perhaps a tweaking of certain ways in which we think maybe about identity and specifically about maybe racial or ethnic identity that perhaps could help the broadening of this notion of what it means to be Singaporean or our national identity. But I think there's still limits, right? Of course, there's a link between policy or structures and everyday encounters, as Raj indicated. But, you know, it also goes the other way, right? Our encounters should also then, and they do, shape structures, right? They can have the possibility of changing structures. So I think there's also a place for more ground up level change to happen in terms of, you know, through education, through interpersonal encounter, people talking to each other saying, hey, you know, these are older attitudes, or that's, you know, like not right. You shouldn't say that. And we see, for example, along gender identities, I think a lot of the public discourse has changed, right? And we see this, for example, reflected in the repeal of 377A. Right. I think that's a response to particular attitudes and counter change. So, you know, I think it's both ways. We shouldn't just rely on policy to change everything or top down, but we, you know, also need to, you know, foster interactions at the ground level that can create change.
Thank you, Lavi. I'm going to move on to a question by Paul Hedges. This specific question addressed to Raj and myself. So according to Paul, the papers from both of us seem to suggest that we need to have an everyday coexistence or conviviality. But in many societies, we have seen this everyday coexistence fractured when stress is tested. So Paul cited examples of Ambon or the Balkan states. So any thoughts on how to build a resilient coexistence or more robust conviviality? Raj, would you like to go first on this?
Thank you for the question, Paul. I guess with the examples you've cited there, these were really extreme scenarios, right? In Ambon, Moluccas, and even the Balkans, where the sort of deep-rooted sort of cleavages, religious or otherwise, becomes a testing point. And I think as Lavi and even Chan would have stressed, we see that level of sort of extreme fracture is quite uncommon in Singapore, and partly because the way politicians and policies have worked to build, a sort of harmonious coexistence. And likewise, I think where in my paper I pointed to all these various sort of spaces and sites where, obviously it's not always hunky-dory. We're always going to have tensions and conflict with neighbors, and we know that there's been a spike of that. But regardless, and in my recent visit to Singapore, accompanying my mom to the wet market, and just the way people moved in the buses. There was a disabled person. Everyone made way for the bus driver to push the wheelchair up and give a place to an older person. So I think that sort of commonalities are fairly strong, and we probably should speak a lot about that, right? Emphasize that sort of narratives, and just like in today's paper, I just saw the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Law, right? Shanmugam stressing about the importance of ensuring religious harmony in Singapore with what is happening in Gaza and so on. So I think, it's a, I wouldn't say brighter, it's a better scenario in the Singapore context.
Well, when we talk about resilient, it's always about the idea of how do you bounce back from setback, right? What does it take to make you that you can withstand challenges better? And at least in the realm of psychology, you always believe that some kind of testing, some kind of stress testing or inoculation, if you like, will help us prepare for conflicts, for negotiations, for contradictions that comes out of this. And this is actually not uncommon, because the whole idea is being able to engage one another and feel safe, that we can engage one another to present our perspective, right? To kind of articulate what may be disturbing perhaps to one group versus the other. That kind of engagement helps. And to foster that conviviality and resilient outlook, I think it's important that apart from creating opportunities for interaction, very much apart from that, is the opportunity for some kind of stress testing, if you like, trying to understand why, why is it that certain rituals or norms may be considered offensive? Why is it that perhaps some other groups may find Singaporeans may not think that it's okay to do this? So having that kind of create a kind of environment where you can validate, you can query, and I think that helps. And typically, at the national level, you create that through different forms of dialogues, having different platform to engage, and importantly, it's an opportunity to clarify, right? So that provide that very safe space for a form of social inoculation, and that will be the kind of interventions or programs that I think will be helpful, to encourage a more convivial perspective, right? I have another one question. This is from a colleague from NIE. This is Pei Dong, right, from NIE. And he said I felt, according to him, right, I felt very optimistic about diversity and multicultural coexistence in Singapore after listening to this session. Thank you so much. And I'm reinforced of my existing impression, and in particular to Larry's paper, based on what you shared, right? Now, I feel like maybe sometimes we overplay the significance of CMIO, right? And in the long run, right, it really wouldn't matter, because you will simply in the not too long future, maybe it wouldn't really matter because it will simply be unable to hold the kind of real hybridity and diversity that Singapore population is now exhibiting, right? So my sense with the young generation of Singaporeans, so from the teens to 30, they were really not as stuck with the old racial stereotype or silo as much. So my outlook on this is quite optimistic. Would the speakers care to comment on this perspective? Thank you. Levy.
Yeah, maybe I can go first. I think they're definitely more, they're more aware, I think, of diversity, not just in terms of maybe ethnic diversity, but also being connected to the world in different ways, right? Through immigration, through diverse viewpoints. So I think the younger generation is definitely aware of it. but how that will influence the ways in which we think about being Singaporean. How can we expand those notions, perhaps while still maintaining a sense of cohesion, a sense of national identity, right? That I think is key in thinking about inoculation, as Chan Hoon put it, right? I think that's what will be interesting to see, right? Yeah.
Raj, what do you think of the CMIO category?
Honestly, I think it's not going to go away. But as the participant has pointed out, and even Lavi is alerting us to, is that we're going to see that as maybe problematic categorization. Perhaps we all should, rightfully be fitting in the other category once we have this kind of inter-ethnic marriages and so forth, and connections to elsewhere. And then perhaps that can lead us to realize this dream of what S. Rajaratnam coined in the 1960s about Singapore being truly global, right? So we may well be a cosmopolitan city-state and be proud of that, as a form of identity, than one that, is hung up or hooked to the CMIO model. So there's some possibilities of new forms of identity emerging. That's my sense.
That's a very interesting point. I don't think personally, I don't think CMIO, the categorization, is going to go away. By and large, I think it serves a more functional purpose, a more administrative purpose, be that for housing, for electoral politics, for school and self-help groups. I think that categorization will remain. But you could have the categorization perform at a functional level, but that social psychological classification done at a different level. In other words, looking beyond the CMIO, right? And I guess for some Singaporeans, the question then is, do we still therefore need that? Because if you don't look at a person according to the racial background, then what's the purpose of having it? I think that kind of questions, that kind of queries will remain. But I think what's even more important is, not to have the discussion centered around purely on classification, but rather look across classification, which is the reason why I argue, that it's important to look beyond, what would be the boundaries, and look at what is in common for all. I think that has a greater implications to what does it mean, being Singaporean and as a cohesive society, so to speak. I have one perhaps question here to me, right? This is from Ekmo Zuhairi, right? So this is regarding the shared experiences, right? So thank you for your insights. Your suggestions to more fully harness shared experiences is important. However, to what extent do you see that approach as limiting social cohesion or limiting solidarity too much to likeness, especially when society is increasingly diverse along ethnic, gender, class, and other lines? Well, to be honest, I think that's precisely because why society is increasingly diverse along those lines that you talk about, be that ethnic, gender, and class, that it's even more important to look at what is in common. And increasingly, I think it's harder and harder to find out what are some of the common intersections, because we have a lived experience that is so much centered around differences, right? So if you grow up in a upper middle income background, your experience, your engagement with somebody from a different race will be limited, right? And that's not it may not be a fault of yours, but it's just a natural kind of social environment that you were brought up. So having to be able to look at what will be the common experiences, be that in the school, be that in the workplace, for national service, and so on. I think those are important things to explore. And I think going back to Raj's presentation, the urban common spaces, those are ever more important right, for a super diverse society, right, to create that organic opportunities. And I emphasize the word organic because these are the words, these are the kind of natural experiences that is important, in order to forge that understanding of with people from different background. Right. So that will be my answer to your question. Right.
Is there time for me to ask a question, or are we run out of time?
I think we could have one. You can have a last question.
So I mean, I guess this is mostly a question to Raj, but also I think to Chan Hoon. So my question was, I mean, I know we're talking about culture, the realm of culture and multicultural, but really, a lot of the spaces, Raj, you talked about are heartland spaces, right? Like coffee shops. And what about, increasing class differences, right? We know that class differences are growing globally within countries. And Singapore is no exception, like through the work of my colleague Chiu Yu Yen, for example, right? So how, I mean, what you talk about everyday encounter, the conviviality, isn't that something that has been happening for maybe centuries, even for a long time? I mean, what is qualitatively different about say kampong life versus HDB life? Weren't people living together convivially before? So and isn't the change really the growing class divide? So, linking that to, for example, Chan Hoon's emphasis on shared spaces, even shared institutions like schools or NS, right? We know, for example, that maybe more upper middle class people might choose to send their kids to different schools, even if they're Singaporean after primary school, right? So it's again different shared experiences. A lot of children of migrants who I meet, they only meet Singaporeans for, and especially working class Singaporeans during national service, right? Because they come from very elite backgrounds, right? So there's, I think, a limited, I mean, yes, there is a role for these institutions, but I think it's still limited through class. So how can we think about, super diversity, for example, and how, yeah, how can we bridge class divides that perhaps are more significant than cultural or ethnic divides?
Raj, I'm gonna you're gonna have the last word on this, but short because I need to do a quick intro on the book and then I'm gonna wrap it up.
Thank you. Yes, it's a very important point there, particularly the big division between the well-to-do and the heartland Singaporeans. I guess, yeah. I mean, the way to bridge that would be the kind of stories that we tell, right? That Chan Hoon and yourself have highlighted the stories of the common experience. Even if you're living in private estate or whatever, the connection to food, to places, still in some ways can bring us together. And maybe, yeah, I know it's a huge obstacle to overcome, but it's not a difficult one. That's my sense. But it's a very good point.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you so much. I know there are a lot of burning questions from everyone here, but we are running out of time. So I'm just going to take one additional minute to kind of introduce you to the book that Raj, Labi, and I have been talking about. I think a lot of the examples were actually cited from the book. All right, so this is book Confident Identities and Connected Communities. This is actually the product of the ICCS 2022 International Conference on Cohesive Society, right? And the conference kind of revolved around issues on faith, identity, and cohesion, precisely on those things that we have talked about in the last 1.5 hours. And more importantly, given the kind of climate that we experience today, one of the things that we talk about a lot is how do you build the connections through shared experiences. So do check it out if you can. And I just want to highlight 4 fabulous chapters here that you can find in the book. Apart from the chapter from Raj, we also have an essay from a history professor, Farish Noor, and talk about the normality of uncertainty. Since time immemorial, actually uncertainty has always been a part of us, and how we can have a better understanding of that will help us, tide us through, right, with some of the challenges that we face today. And also have Professor Yoshiko, who talk about complexity, and again, how society can navigate through complexities by having a better understanding of that that kind of everyday experiences. And finally, there's one on cyberspace, right, on an online connection? How do you develop and build trust, right, by connection through online platform? All right, so that is certainly one book that you should not miss, and do check it out if you can. Right, and with that, we have come to the end, right, of this webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming on board. Really, a great pleasure to have you, right? And we hope to see you again for our future events. Thank you so much and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all your questions and engagement.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you guys.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.